Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nick Ishmael Perkins, and I am the director at SciDevNet. And with Teavo Pelonomi here, we're going to be co-moderating this afternoon's plenary. As I look around this amazing room, I am moved to say a big thank you to our Finnish colleagues for hosting us here. It does actually say something about the level of inspiration that we should be aiming for, I think. Okay, this afternoon session actually came out of a discussion that was had at the Finnish embassy in the UK about 2 months ago. And one of the things that came up during that discussion was a bit of research which SciDevNet has done with the London School of Economics and the Musée de Video in Brazil, where we surveyed around 700 science journalists around the world, looking at the state of science journalism. And there were a few things that came out of that which we thought were quite intriguing. The first of these was that actually it was very difficult to identify our constituency. There is no established league of science journalists globally, and it was entirely emic, basically, how people define themselves as belonging to the community or not, and there were no clear criteria around that. And that presented a number of methodological challenges, but I think it also presents us with an interesting political challenge. The second thing was that we found amongst the northern journalists, there was quite a lot of pessimism about the state of science journalism. Very few said that they would recommend this as a career to younger people and to colleagues. But they did have very good working standards generally. So they worked less hours, they were generally better paid. And the third finding that provoked some discussion was that, in contrast, amongst our peers in the global south, there was quite a lot of optimism about science journalism. A large percentage said that they would recommend it as a profession to peers and to younger people. But interestingly, we found that working conditions there were actually quite wanting. So people worked very long hours. Security of livelihood was a real issue, and pay was not actually particularly rewarding. And so this raises actually, we think, a number of really interesting questions for the future of the profession. You know, for instance, is it fair to assume, by extension, that there are certain differences in core skills that were required from one country or one context to another? Those of you who would have seen Hans Rosling's presentation, he said that this idea of the developing world and developed world is actually very 20th century. And indeed, one wonders how we might or might not be reproducing this in ideas about science journalism in developing countries. The other thing is that, you know, we all work actually in the scientific method, and there's some interesting questions here about whether or not we could categorize or provide some kind of taxonomy around different contexts or different countries. And then finally, of course, what does this mean for what we think of as core skills? I was very struck by the plenary yesterday, where in fact there was quite a lot of time spent on time management and on funding management as new skills for the enterprising science journalists. So a number of questions for us to reflect on. And what we've done is that we've pulled together a panel here who are going to start the conversation. They're not going to appropriate it, and they're certainly not going to finish it, because there are actually almost 80 countries represented amongst us here today. And we expect that a number of you will be able to make a contribution. But what we have here are actually 4 panelists who provide some very interesting perspectives because of their geographic area of practice, because of their discipline, and also because of the kind of exposure that they have to science journalists. Okay, so to begin with, I would like to introduce Philip Hiltz, who is the director of the Knight Science Fellowship Program, a Science Journalism Fellowship Program at MIT. Philip has also written about 6 books. He's an award-winning science journalist and has been a Neumann Fellow at Harvard University. Philip?
Thank you. I want to tell you a little bit about my perspective on this. I'm going to give you just a few things I'm interested in from the perspective of the West. On internet and the news, the challenges that we're going to be facing. At MIT, we have two different groups. One group is master's candidates in science writing. These are 22, 23, 24-year-olds, people who have started into science and then are switching. And there were 10 of those per year, and I teach those. And then we have another dozen who are mid-career, fully successful science journalists who come to MIT and Harvard to study anything they want and recharge their careers. Very different group of people. They blend together, of course, very well. We have, and this year we're adding a new fellow, a 13th fellow, someone who instead of coming to study will come and do a project, a year-long project, a digital journalism project. And so in the West, we're facing this issue about what's new and what's different. Jobs have been lost. Where did these journalists go? They are now many freelancers instead of on staff and so on. But what's happening with the internet and in the last 15, 20 years in journalism, science journalism, the core is fundamentally the same. The biggest challenge is the old challenge. That is, the job is to find news and report it in accurately in detail and correctly. That's the hardest job. That's what you spend all your time doing. But the environment has changed some, and we have some new things we have to think about. Now, this is the book that was published just before the deluge, just before the internet blew up and came to all of us. But this is the basic statement of what journalists try to do, how they try to do it. This is the standard, which is still good. You still have to have this. New conditions, more information faster. So when I started reporting, originally when I wanted to do a report on the National Academy of Sciences on a particular topic, I had to get up from my desk, go across town, get a copy of the thing, bring it back, read it. Not anymore. Now, instantly I have the whole text, a summary, everything on my desk. So this puts a burden on journalists. The fact that there is more information faster. We have to pay attention. We have to move fast to catch it all. The forums have changed. The forums now include blogs, video, audio, tweets, and more. And everyone is a journalist. Anybody who starts a blog and says he's a journalist, he is. And we have to accept that. So our fellows now, both the young students and the older fellows, now also get audio training, video training, training on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and others. So this is now necessary. You may not have to use them all, but you have to know them all. And it turns out, we thought Twitter was a little bit silly in the beginning. It turns out it's not. It's a significant tool. In the old days, you were defined by where you worked. I worked at the New York Times for many years. Now, if I were out in the field, I would be defined more by my own brand, by my blog, by the quality of my work. You have to be an individual brand if you don't happen to be at the New York Times. And now the New York Times has many blogs. And those bloggers are defined partly by the New York Times, but they're not on the New York Times. They're not on the staff, so they're defined more by themselves and their work. So one of the problems I want to raise is that you used to have a newspaper that was delivered on the doorstep in the morning, and this is a very nice package of how, this is what you should read, this is your news. New York Times, very easy. That's gone. When I ask my science writing students, where do they start? Where do they get their news? They start, and this makes me very sad, they start with Google News every morning. And that's a terrible place to start. It's junk, You have a very good story from the New York Times, and right next to it, a Fox News story. So I try to tell them. But so now the students in journalism have to build their own sources. This is my front page, and what I have is long strings of different sources. This is like the front page of a newspaper, except every piece is a news organization. So we have to find a way to let people know what are the good organizations to follow and how to build something like this for themselves and which ones they should avoid. We might build some kind of system in which we rate the organizations on reliability. It's for the future. I don't know if we can do that. And this is the other main point I wanted to make about What's happening in the future? I think this story is the one that will confront us the most in the future. The biggest story, the one that is just coming up over the horizon, that is going to be very surprising. Every day we create 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. 90% of the data in the world has been created in the past 2 years. World capacity from 3 exabytes to 295 in 2007. It's tripling every 3 years. What this means for journalists is that, let me give you one example. I think I have a, yeah. This is a thing Google did. One year they tracked the searches during flu season. And they asked, through software, they asked to compare what happened in flu in the US, the dates, the amounts, the cities, and then they asked the computer to find correlations. They didn't say, here are some things to look for. It said, find any correlations in the searches. And they found very quickly that there were about 45 search terms that, if you used them, and they took them to the next year to test it, if you used them, you could track the flu faster and better than the Centers for Disease Control. 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time, they saw it happening because they were seeing searches by people about their symptoms even before they went to the doctor and so on. This is not a statistical study. This is massive data. And so this is a very interesting approach, and we're going to see more of this. The FDA now in the US is working with Google to track adverse effects from drugs the same way. Look at the searches, see what's going on. Entirely different than the classical statistics. Classical statistics gives you a way to see things you could never see by small samples. Now, there's no random, detailed rigor, et cetera. This is big, sloppy data, but this is going to be very important. And so I think, and now you notice what this is. It's called, up in the upper left, industry agenda. So you're talking, they have in industry and in government, this discussion is beginning. They have data on all of us. Everybody who has a cell phone can be tracked everywhere all the time. Your searches. So masses of data on people, and the question is, who's going to use it? What are the rules going to be? The governments are in conversation with the companies right now about these subjects. And so I think this is a real opportunity. You'll have very different kinds of stories. For example, now you have in America databases on medical errors at every hospital. So you can put all those together now, and you could jumble them and then see which hospitals have huge numbers of errors on what things, how did they get there, and which ones are very safe. These are things we could never see before, and we're going to be able to see them in spades in the future. This means journalists are going to have a couple of different kinds of stories to write. Stories in which you use the data, and you make data visualization presentations, or you write about what people are doing with the data. And what I think about this is that this is, let's see. Yeah, this is something journalists need to have. This is a story that we do not want to leave to the political reporters. This is a story about big data and how it's going to be used that is technical and means a lot to the people. And I think, so this is a story that we should wrestle away from the political reporters and let science journalists go with it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Our next speaker has already created a buzz amongst the panelists, and I think we're all very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Wendy. When we talk about reflections across cultures, we're not always thinking just about geographical cultures, because culture can also be defined by discipline or professional community. And Wendy Yared is actually a doctor of public health and is a director of the European Cancer Leagues and previously worked with the World Health Organization. Wendy is not herself a journalist, but has put together some thoughts about core journalism skills based on her engagement with journalists and some of the issues that she's addressing every day. Wendy, I'm going to suggest that you use this mic if that's okay. Yeah.
Yes, so
operate in an ecosystem of power in all sorts of directions, and it would behoove us to be aware of how it's exercised and when it's being exercised on us. Next, I want to introduce a very familiar figure to many of you. Jean-Marc Fleury is the director of the World Federation of Science Journalists. He is also the Science Journalist Chair at Laval University in Quebec. Previously, he was the head of communications at the International Development Research Centre. And the World Federation of Science Journalists runs a program supporting interns and has done that now for the last 5 years or so. And I'm sure a number of you have heard, and in fact, some of you in the room have probably been through the Scooped program.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to relate to you my experience as Executive Director of the World Federation of Science Journalists. It has exposed me to different cultures, many different countries. And so the way I reframed this session is, are the skills required from science journalists the same in every country and every culture? One would think so. Science is universal. Everywhere journalists search for the truth and speak for the public's interest. And everywhere people are confused by contradictory claims from individuals, many of them with PhDs. But then, during my life, I had interesting encounters. The Federation thinks narrative science writing is good. And I was in a session in Paris, and because I was promoting narrative style, narrative science writing, someone accused me of being at the service of American imperialism. So, there are differences. I'm not sure this is cultural. And my point, you will see later, is that probably if there are differences, maybe they're not that related to culture. They're more related to politics. Maybe there's also a connection somewhere, or economics. So in Quebec also, when we have meetings, I'm from the French-speaking part of Canada, Quebec. We have 2 languages, 2 communities of science journalists. And when the 2 communities meet, one thing that came out is that for the Quebec science journalists, when they are asked what they write about, they will say that it is important for them to give a voice to the Quebec scientist. And in Canada, the only magazine that still exists that popularizes science is in Quebec. But our colleagues in Canada who work in English, when you ask them, will you give more importance to Canadian scientists, they say, no. Science is universal. I will interview scientists who are the best wherever they come from. So that's another difference that I've encountered. Now, I'm going to show you the second slide. And this is, I think there is this thing. Sorry. Oops, too fast. Okay, so this is a try of this Scoop project at defining core skills in science journalism. And during our training of journalists in Africa and the Arab world, we inflicted this on the African and the Arab journalists. We measured the quality of their articles with these criteria, several of them having 3 sub-criteria. And there was, you can see probably right there, if you go to the first 3 general indicators, probably people would agree that they're valid everywhere. But if you go to the specific indicators, the second one, policy reference, maybe I'm wrong, but if you interview science journalists in Canada, they might not say that they want to influence governments as a priority, that they want to change the way governments operates and delivers services in their country. They will say, I want to write good stories, and some will say, I want to entertain. They want to participate in debates, but to change things, change policies in the country, when we ask the Arab and the African journalists to rate their priority tasks, There was a list of about 20 priorities, and at the top, among the 4 top priorities, they were all related to how they could change the laws and the programs in their countries. So we listened to that, and we acknowledge you want to have an impact on policies, so we will measure the quality of your articles by the connections to policy issues. So I think these criteria would not be used in Canada, but we use them in Africa and for the Arab journalists. So the next slide is about these tasks that the journalists told us in Africa and in Arab countries that were their priorities. So the very first on top was educating the public on science. Well, in Canada, if you ask science journalists, are you educators? They will say, no, it's not our role. The school system will educate Canadians about science. But they do some of that. But in Africa, for the Arab and African journalists, educating the public about science was the top priority. And then, as I said, the next 3 ones are all related to bringing social changes in their countries. And then, quite high, providing practical advice to the people. And this is interesting also for us because we're beginning a similar program in Asia. And the coordinator of the program in Vietnam is here. I don't see him in this room, but he explained to me that in Vietnam, okay, it's a communist country. In a communist regime, the government knows what is good, and the journalists translate and give the message to the people what they should do. So each article has to end with a recommendation. They don't let some space for people to conclude from the facts provided. They have to tell people very direct instructions, what they should do. And it is a feature of the articles. So this is it cultural? I don't think it is cultural. I think it's the political context. And then, you know, we were, Palab Ghosh, he has a big argument with number 15 there, I'm sure. But in the Arab world, in Africa, journalists want, there is science still has credibility. I think it still has credibility in Canada, in other countries. But for the journalists, they see this as one of their tasks to show people that science is important, is reliable. And I have friends here from Africa who can explain why it's so important. Feedback to local knowledge to scientists. No, that's another very interesting feature. And in Canada, I hope the Canadian Science Writers Association that we've tried, even us, the World Federation, to have a program with the Canadian associations where we would have someone from the indigenous communities in Canada to be trained as a science journalist. And this would be such a key feature of the training because a journalist coming from northern parts of Canada relating to his group would have to take into account the local knowledge, the traditional knowledge. And then explaining latest scientific findings is at the very bottom, which is what many of my colleagues in Canada do. This is, we wait every Thursday. There is Nature, Science coming out, and we write about the latest development in science. So if you're in Africa, if you're in the Arab world, maybe you don't live in the same kind of environment. But again, I think there are many differences. There are differences. I have a friend here in this room who claimed that there was an African science journalism, and I've challenged him many times, and he has never really argued it correctly to me, so I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Gervais, but maybe later you can explain what you meant by this. And so for us in the World Federation, it it is a very interesting world because we believe that colleagues can help colleagues. We're the community, we're your community, the science journalists. So we think where we can play a role is to have some of you help another colleague in another country. And there is a clash, I think, of a culture there because of the way science journalism is practiced. And where we lived the clash in our program is that the African and Arab journalists, and maybe it will be the same in Asia. There are people from Asia here who can say something about this. But the problems are so urgent. Children die from diseases. There are practical, urgent issues. So the journalists are driven by, urgencies. And my mentors from Europe, from North America, they would see that the scientific argumentation in the article was not that strong. That sometimes even they would use words they didn't understand perfectly. So their focus was to help them write better, solid scientific article, which is a good goal. But what we concluded, and my conclusion that I want to give you, is that I think when we do training, and there are several of us who go in developing countries, who claim we can bring something and we can teach something. But I think there is such an urgency of problems, and we saw journalists who were maybe not writing stories that were meeting, the 9 criteria and the sub-criteria that you saw in the previous slide. Oops, that's... Okay, here. But we should organize our training so that we support them to make a good case. Because what we saw is that even if the articles were not that great at meeting these criteria, they had a tremendous impact because they knew where the stories are. They knew the issues. They were opportunistic, and they hit at very good places. So I think it is... I've learned many things. And the conclusion I can share with you is that maybe some of the training we have to accept that, these criteria that are still important. We should mellow a bit, wait, but help them from where they are and build good argumentation so that eventually they have... Probably, if they also meet those criteria, they will even have bigger impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. Very interesting reflections on moving away from the kind of deficit model of training in science journalism. I would like to introduce now Estrella Burgos, who is the editor-in-chief of an award-winning science magazine for youth and adolescents in Mexico called Como Ves. And Estrella herself actually also teaches science journalism courses and has written textbooks on science for schools. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon. I'm very impressed by what you said, Jean-Marc, because there's a lot of overlapping between what you said and what you probably might expect to find in Mexico if you come to do the same thing, that I hope you will.
Thank you.
So I'm going to give you a really brief overview on what's happening in science journalism in Mexico as far as we know, because we don't know that much yet, but we're trying to get there. Well, I want to start with story number 1. That's something that happened to me a long time ago, 20 years ago. I was desperate to get some job. I was freelancing at the time, and I went to see this editor that happened to be a friend of my family, and he was regarded at the time as one of the very best journalists in the country. And he was, and he still is. And I I realized that his magazine, it is a weekly magazine, that had a huge impact in the culture and politics in Mexico. And they never covered science. So, you know, I was naive enough and I went to say, I had this great idea. Why don't you cover science? And you hired me to do it. And this is what he said to me. I remember it very well because it was very impressive. People don't care about science. General audiences don't understand science. There's no such thing as science journalism. And if it were, I wouldn't hire you, but a prominent scientist. It was very shocking. I was totally defeated. But why? This was not a bad man. He was, on the contrary, he's a great person. He's a wonderful journalist. He really cares for his country and his countrymen. But that's maybe the explanation, that Mexico has a very long-standing tradition in science communication. Museums, magazines, books, some TV, some radio. And all this was started out by scientists themselves, but not so in science journalism. And that's the first downs I'm going to show you. Is quite recent, if strictly speaking. And very scarce. If you scan the media, you won't see that much good science journalism, or science journalism at all, for that matter. And there's this confusion, it persists, the difference between science popularization and science journalism. They usually are mixed together on the media, and sometimes I'm not sure if it's that bad, exactly because of what you just said. You know, the concerns we have in countries like mine, in poor countries with very urgent things to solve. This happens a lot, I'm very sad to say. You see a press release from a university. In this case, somebody was doing these maps of native birds, and next thing you see is in a newspaper, the exact same press release, word for word, only with somebody's name on it. And you probably are shocked, but this is common practice. Not even the sources think this is bad. They kind of are counting on that. And sometimes they prefer to have the press release the exact same thing they did, somebody else's work, than not to have it, or to have it copied and pasted in strange ways. But that happens a lot. And still, like that editor I met 20 years ago, still agree that people really don't care about science. They say, well, science is kind of cute, you see, it's interesting, but it doesn't really matter. Unfortunately, there are lots of politicians in Mexico that think the very same way. Not all, mercifully. But we have science magazines, where we mix science journalism and science popularization. To begin with, because we don't have that many science journalists. We don't even know how many. When I was talking to Jean-Marc some time ago in Washington, asking if my association could belong to the Federation, he asked me how many journalists, science journalists, are in your association. And I really couldn't answer him, and I still can't, because we really don't know how many are there in the country. Okay. Oh. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, there's little science journalism in all, you know, in all the mainstream media. You will see not many things. And talking about digital times, much less on that. From science journalists. And by science journalists here, I'm meaning somebody that lives out of that makes a living out of that. At least mainly, at least 70% of the time. Okay, why? Well, we don't really know why. We will try to find out that very soon. My association just opened up several professional chapters within the organization, or divisions. We call them divisions. One is science journalism. I'm in charge of that one. And we had a meeting in last October to try to figure out what was really happening in Mexico. So we had 3 experts, 3 of the best science journalists. We are estimating that we had between 10 and 20, so we had 3 of the very best, and they gave us opinions on what was going on with the media and their own work. And then in a group that with members of this division and other divisions from the association, you know, everybody said what they thought the problems were, the main problems, and how we could address these problems from the association, what we could really do to improve science coverage in Mexico. And at first, we identified problems. From the side of the media, you see the situation hasn't changed that much since 20 years ago when I had that shocking experience. Many editors think like that, you know, and they use science as a filler, you know, the last minute in the newsroom. Oh, that looks nice, put it in there, right? And there are certainly lots of journalists that cover many things on the same day. And they have to attend these press conferences on science and then run to the newsroom. And so it's really hard for them to actually do an accurate job. It's nearly impossible, I would say, if you have to work in such conditions. We don't have that much training. We have short courses and seminars. No formal training whatsoever. But for a few schools, in my university, there's a communications career there, and there's a subject, a topic, and sometimes seminars on that in other schools too, but no graduate courses at all. From the side of science, these are extended beliefs amongst scientists regarding science journalism. There's now the notion of a watchdog it's really not very well understood there. And they usually think that you should show, as a journalist, your work to them before you publish it, because you surely are going to make big mistakes. And yeah, and that happens. To tell you the truth, that happens. Big mistakes are made, but there are other ways to solve that. Of course, you all know that. And one main problem is that it's really hard to find out what our researchers are doing. If you compare that to developed countries, it's very hard to find that information. It's not available, easily available, or anything. You have to rely on the people you know, or somebody told you, or etc. And because there are very few communication offices and public information officers in Mexico. So what we need to do, as we decided in that meeting, we have to do lots of research first to really find out the reasons this is happening and how to address it. So how good is the science coverage, or bad, or how much? We need to find out really what are the journalists doing, how many of them are science journalists, how they work, their circumstances, very much like what SciDev.net did in its global report. Actually, I already asked them if I can borrow some of the methodology for this survey. And what do editors really think? We don't know why they use science as a filler. We really don't know. So we need to go ask them and see if they care to answer us. That's going to be difficult. And to make the information on what's being published more available. So I'm about to finish here. Very recently, the National Council of Science and Technology approved some funding for my association to do this, at least these two things, this survey of journalists and to assess the science coverage throughout the country in printed media, in TV, in radio, internet. And we're developing now a proposal that initially they say they really are interested in supporting, to have a new service for science journalists, so they you know, perhaps not even press releases, but just short information so they can see what's going on with the research, and a database with papers. You know, when a paper was published and who's the authors and what institution they belong to. So they are interested in doing this, and they will probably fund that. So we hope, like, in the near future, we can have that information available for every journalist. Okay. And the opposite is that there's really the interest in training, in practicing science journalism is increasing amazingly fast in Mexico. So there's a demand for all these things. And we have also plans for longer courses, especially at my university. And there have been more communications, probably there have been more communication offices coming very soon, at least in my university, and sometimes in others too. So the story 4 is that it's not yet written, and I hope to give you really great news and a happy ending in 2015. Thank you.
Thank you, Estrella. I'm just thinking, actually, what kind of science skills do you need when science journalism is mistaken for filler? Okay, what I thought we might do now is to open up to some discussion. As I've said before, I know that there are a lot of us in the room who have experience from different countries and different perspectives, and a lot of people fanning, so I know it's hot and a bit stuffy, and already a hand in the air. I also want to encourage the panelists to feel free to ask questions of each other, because as we've said, you're not just repositories of knowledge, you also can get into the discussion. I am going to just come over to Palab.
Palab Ghosh from BBC News. Thank you all for great talks. I just wanted to feed into where Australia left off about interest in science stories. Even in the UK, it's sort of, until relatively recently, been a struggle to demonstrate to editors that things apart from politics and foreign affairs are things that viewers and listeners and our audience are interested in. It's been made much easier with the advent of the website, where the audience get to vote with the number of hits. So, for example, on a day when there was another wave of attacks on Libya, and that was the lead story on the BBC News website, there was a piece on supersymmetry where the audience were much bigger. There were double the number of hits for the piece on supersymmetry than the thing that was leading on the website and leading on the main TV and radio programmes. The BBC World News did a piece of research when it relaunched itself as to what its audiences in different parts of the world were interested in. For years it had adopted a geopolitical agenda, had pictures of people getting off airplanes, entering buildings, and then doing the reverse, and talking about talks, thinking that that's what the audience were interested in. Research showed that they were interested in health, environment, and science. But even when the editors, and so that's led to me getting on air more, which is always a good thing. But even when the research does show clearly that this is what the audience wants, editors simply don't believe them. A colleague of mine, Alok Jha, who I don't know if he's here, told me the Guardian commissioned, in the UK, the Guardian newspaper commissioned a piece of research which showed something similar, and the deputy editor said, that's all very well, but they're still going to get politics.
Thank you. I know that there was a similar bit of research done in West Africa. In fact, 2 pieces of research done in West Africa in the last couple of years, and both of them suggested actually that there was a real demand for science and technology and health news and analysis. And that's actually provoked an interesting discussion amongst media there. Any other comments or questions? The panelists, do you have any? Yeah.
Yeah, you just remind me of something, because not only do the journalists have a lot of power in putting the information out there, but I noticed that we go on the BBC News website from time to time, and we see responses from readers, because you let them post responses. And I'm wondering if that's moderated, because sometimes they say the most ridiculous things. And it also gives us insight on what the public knows and what they don't know. So for example, when there were issues about sunbed use, there was one comment from somebody saying, oh, we shouldn't use the sunbeds. The next thing they're going to say is that the sun causes cancer. How can you not know about such a basic fact? And so that, it kind of scared us to know that this person is out there actually hinting that the sun does not cause cancer. And so is that even moderated at all? Because that's also a news item then. I mean, if you let people blog and provide comments, and that's also a source of information.
Sure. That would be helpful.
The comment section used to be called "Have Your Say," and a comedian said that really the people that contribute to that section ought to have their say gently but politely taken away from them. So I know what you mean. The comments can be ridiculous. They are moderated, but in the main, I do think that it is good to find out what people think about issues. Things that are completely wrong or insulting are removed from the comment section of the BBC News website and other, similar websites. But I think it is important to try and listen to what people think, provided that it's not wrong or insulting.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, I can see a couple. Just gentleman just in the middle there, and then... I was going to actually, as we're waiting for the question, I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair and ask a very quick question of you, Jean-Marc. Am I putting you in an awkward position? A couple of times you suggested that actually some of these differences might not be cultural, but about political context. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit how you understand the difference between political context and culture. And I think this is perhaps quite an important point, because you talk about an ongoing conversation you have about whether or not there is a difference. And I wonder if actually understanding the source of that difference might help us to be able to determine the extent to which it exists.
Okay. I'm sorry about the phone. It's just that we're waiting for a phone call to know who's going to be the next person who will have my job. So I purposefully kept my phone open. And but Nick, I don't know what to do with your question. I think I'm proud of my culture. I guess I have a culture. We're all proud of our cultures, but I think in Africa and in Arab countries, if the science journalists are driven by urgencies, it is because of the economics of the. And in Quebec, if we still value and give importance to the Quebec scientists, it's because we have not reached a level of development where our scientists are really world players. And so I think in the end, it is probably related more to economics, to, I don't know, if you're in a different political regime, journalism is really tied to society. For me, culture, it's more, well, this is, I don't know, maybe this thing about narrative style and, well, one example we came across, probably that is culture related, is that in the eastern parts of Europe, I've been told that a flowery style is preferred than just presenting the facts, and that leads to a kind of mix of presenting facts and mixing commentaries. And that, for someone who comes from North America, that's a strange kind of journalism. So maybe there it is related to culture. But I think the differeces that we saw in our training program, I don't think they were that much related to culture. Maybe we have not hit deep enough, and we'll find something eventually. But so far, I think they're more related to economics and the means available to people. So I'm not sure I'm answering.
No, it's very helpful. I mean, I was trying to understand. I mean, it sounds to me as if you're suggesting that culture is sometimes about the way that people communicate, whereas politics might be about what they want to communicate about. Is that what you're suggesting in terms of objectives and the difference between different countries? Anyway, it's just something to reflect on. Yes.
Ron Winslow from NASW in the U.S. It occurs to me that the training programs that each of you have mentioned, and probably most of our training programs, focus largely on the journalists who are reporting the science. And already we've had a couple questions and examples of where our big gap is in the editors who edit science or who have to edit science as part of their job. I mean, I always find one of my hardest jobs is when I have an editor change. I have to train a new editor, and but you know, editors who think science is only filler, or editors who think that a preliminary result needs a definitive headline. There's all manner of things that I'm sure are in all of our countries where we really need our editors to have some perspective on this too, and especially in organizations where you have a fairly small staff, you have one or two people who are covering science, they don't even have a colleague that they can bounce things off of, or not very many, and you have an editor that you still have to convince every time to understand the nuance, to understand the significance, and so forth. So I don't know if there's a whole other area there for editor training, but and then plus editors, when you get downsizing decisions, you know, they're the ones that are blowing up the science staffs in the U.S. Or maybe publishers. But anyway, I think editor training seems to be, maybe that's a possible area for people to think about.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name is Bernard Apia, and I'm a freelance science journalist from Ghana. I do write for SiteDev.net. I personally, have observed a few things, and one of the things I've seen is that getting contact information of scientists in Africa is very difficult. And sometimes when I do get some contact to call, and I call them, the first question they ask me is, so how did you get my number? And it's very, very difficult in the sense that even sometimes where there have been some workshops involving scientists, and they were supposed to write down their telephone numbers, in most cases they will write their organizational numbers instead of their cell phones. And if you call an organization, they will tell you you should bring an official letter. You know, there's so much bureaucracy among scientific institutions in Africa. So I think that whilst we are promoting science journalism by promoting training of journalists, we should also try and bring scientists on board. Perhaps we could organize some workshops for them so that they can become media friendly. And these scientists could be asked to provide their contact details so that those science journalists who may want to contact them may find it very easy to contact them. Thank you.
Yes, I wonder if the panel want to comment on that. I mean, it is interesting, actually, this idea of core science journalism skills for non-science journalists. Yes, Angela.
So I just have an observation and perhaps a suggestion for you to react to. And as I listen to the journalists in the developing world or from the developing world describe a situation of decline for science journalism, and today at the session on science associations, we had the description of science journalism growing and expanding in the developing world. My suggestion is that maybe the journalists in the developing world should learn from these guys how to promote science journalism over again. And maybe this is a session that should be offered by this group at some point.
I have done journalism work in a couple of countries in Africa and in Russia and India. And one of the curious things about this is the notion of saying science journalism alone, just speaking the words, creates trouble. And the journalists often tell me, I do not want to be identified that way. All I do is I go to my editors, I have a great story. Here's the story. It involves a hospital, but no, here's a great story. There are bodies involved. I have a terrific story downstream. There's this contaminant. And you don't mention science, and you sell it on the basis of the stories. Later on, somebody may notice that you do a lot of science stories, but I think it is journalism. And the word science sometimes scares people off.
You're going to say
here. I wanted to comment on your presentation and what they just said is that there might be a way to avoid this apparent contradiction or conflict in between ways we see science journalism in different countries, especially developed and underdeveloped countries. And Phil gave me the tips to do that because you talk about the book by Russell Steele and Kovac. And maybe if we go back to those basic criteria and the social role of journalism, that at least they say, and I believe them, that social role means to give people the information they need to make informed decisions for things that matter to them. So if we resort to that mainly, when it comes to all these differences, I think we're good there. And I would think the African science journalists are doing a great job there.
I think in Mexico you have people doing a good job too. I don't know what happened to this young woman, but a bit to answer Angela. You know, I hear many people who tell me the jobs are disappearing. Well, I created my job as a science journalist. There was no science journalist in my newspaper. Okay, well, the newspapers are having a hard time, that the context is different. But I know a young woman in Mexico. There was a big controversy about a plant being constructed in her city. So she went to the editor of a newspaper and with an article. And for the editor, this is what she told me. It was the first time that he got a good paper. His journalist could not write that kind of article. And he published the article and he hired this young woman. And I don't know what has happened to her, but she told me she became a full-time science journalist in that newspaper. So I think maybe connecting to urgencies, to problems, the way our colleagues have no choice to do in the developing world. Maybe it can work in other countries too. You know, I know I got my job because a laser had been invented in Quebec City, and no newspaper, no journalist in the city could write about it. And that was the little thing that made the newspaper hire me.
Microphones.
Thank you, István Palujai from Budapest, Hungary. I'm the editor in science of the daily paper of Népszabadság, and also I'm the head of the media track of the first Master of Communication MSc in Budapest Eötvös University. So first my comment to you about this upwing stream in Mexico that you mentioned, and the Research Council tried to mention for the media companies to employ more science, more journalists for science. I think this is not a good way, especially it was not a good way as well in Hungary, because the Hungarian Academy of Sciences tried many times to convince and to go to even to the public media, but there was no at all any positive result. Even in public media, all the TV programs stopped. Even the Hungarian news agency, they fired all the last 2 science journalists. So I see 2 very serious and interesting controversies, and after 33 years of being active in science journalism, I am not able to find a real answer. But since only 21 years where I am in this international network, I see more broader and broader community of science journalism. Thanks also for the Science World Federation and for a lot of master courses, the SciDevNet et al. Always there are a much broader community, not only in science journalism but also in science communication. And on the other side, the audience and the public has less and less science in their appetizer in the media in general. I don't know if we are less effective or the society is going into a more commercializing way, but this is, I think, we should have to focus maybe for our future conferences, how could we solve this very, very vivid and more clear contradiction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Estrella, do you want to respond to that?
Totally agree.
Okay.
Neil Byrne, Science in Public, Melbourne. Two thoughts. The first is that I actually think probably news editors are quite keen on science as long as you don't call it science. And I also think that's an issue for the Federation itself, is the Federation sort of gathered here today is an association of people who self-identify as science journalists. And much of the best reporting of science in the world is done by people who don't self-identify as science journalists and don't perceive themselves as being part of this community. So I think one of the challenges for the Federation is how it reaches out and identifies best practice in reporting science and brings it here and helps those people, if you like, come out of the cupboard, self-identify as science journalists, or alternatively simply to use them as benchmarks of some of the best reporting that can be done, regardless of what you call yourself, but recognising the quality of the product.
Yeah, I would say that was a very astute observation. Do any of the panelists want to respond? Yeah.
I don't know, maybe this relates to what you said, Neil, is more and more some people who do science journalism do also science communication. In the morning they will write an annual report for an organization. In the afternoon they will do science journalism. So we just did a survey of science journalists in Quebec and science communicators. And what I've found out is that probably in some instances what is striking is that the fact that a person can earn money because of these contracts gives them the possibility of doing better science journalism and more aggressive science journalism. So in the end, I'm not sure. We have not finished analyzing the data. And one of the questions to the science journalists was, which blog do you go to? And the science journalists in Quebec, they go to the blogs of other science journalists. And you could see that the most credible science journalists in Quebec had more science journalists going to their blogs. And I know that these very credible science journalists, some of them do contract work from time to time. And they are absolutely credible. So I don't know. This is a big issue, because maybe someone can do good science journalism and do other things too. I'm not sure. And if we could create, I don't know, a kind of system where you can measure credibility objectively through the community, it's a challenge maybe for the Federation, for associations, for MIT.
Developing attitude towards this, because many of the people who are on staff are now out freelancing. While on staff, they of course couldn't work for these the NIH or the companies. When they get to be freelancing, then they start with a different attitude. They say, well, I can carve out an area in which is my own area, but another area, say I never do genomics research, I'm willing to take that as something where I can do these other kind of stories because I'm not going to make a living if I don't. And so, and then what you do is you have a conversation with your next editor. You write for the New Yorker. You say, by the way, I did this other genome story for a company. And you ask the editor, does that matter to you? And it's clear now that it doesn't matter as long as it's defined, as long as you have patches where you do that, so that this business of you can apply good skills in both ways, as long as everybody's clear what's happening. So that attitude is new. And it's happening out there now.
I mean, and obviously you would imagine that would have implications as well for training, because actually, you need to be able to work with people who might already be very experienced journalists, but not perhaps very experienced science journalists, and to avoid pitfalls that come with doing science reporting in particular, for instance, and that kind of thing.
You really want to avoid. You don't want to work for the tobacco companies, no matter what. Okay, that would be bad. You would go down, but reasonable places.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
I'm from Egypt. I work as a science journalist, and I have two comments. The first concerning how to consider what we write in newspaper or in broadcasting media or online media and its impact on the health community or the people who are concerned in health community, I mean the scientists. But now we have different scientific opinion, and we face that in science journalism. We face that in reporting, and we do that. We do actually write about arguments between two kinds of controversy between scientists themselves. How would you advise us to report on this? My second comment is about the Arab science journalists and their priorities. I have some questions. How many were the trainers? What are the ratios to the total science journalists in the Arab region? What are their backgrounds? What are their interests? Just as questions.
Okay. I mean, it's probably going to be difficult to answer all of those questions, but Jean-Marc, do you want to say a little bit about the context? And is there anybody who you want to direct your first question at in particular?
Yeah.
Okay, to Wendy. Okay, Wendy, do you want to answer the first question, and then Jean-Marc, you can answer the second? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very excellent question. Is this working? I think it's an excellent question because, of course, you should present both sides of the story to the public. But I think what's important and how you would decide is, I mean, there's some areas that are clearly, I mean, it should be obvious. And if not, I think you should go to the organizations and listen to both sides. Because as I said, it could be that, you know, and I want to go back to what Estrella is saying just for 1 second, because you were saying something about, you know, people copying, pasting stories and putting their names on it and press releases. And that happens also in Europe all the time. And so we never really know exactly, you know, what is the origin of it. And sometimes it might be originating from an industry, pharmaceutical company, or even tobacco industry. We have, you know, because the source is kind of hidden. But I think if, again, I want to go back to research skills. I think if you have that base to know exactly how to look for this, you would be able to find out. Going back to the vitamin D controversy, I'm pretty sure that these people were contacted by the sunbed industry saying, you know, you really need to focus on this, because they knew we were having a meeting at the European Parliament. And I think that's something, you know, if it's a journalist based in Europe writing about this, that person did not do his or her homework. They should have known that there was going to be a meeting happening at the European Parliament. So I think if you just do a bit more research or just ask several organizations, you must have some organizations that you can go to as reliable information, if you could do that. But that would really help a lot. You're from the Middle East. My husband is from the Middle East. And so I always see these funky stories, you know, and I say, where does it come from? And it's a lot based on, you know, folk beliefs. And I think it does a lot of damage. But I think in those cases, they probably want to sell the story more than thinking about how is it going to affect how people would behave. Good question.
Jean-Marc, did you want to respond quickly?
Yes, because we have, if you give me your email, we'll send you the detailed analysis. The thing I remember, and sorry, Mohammed, to say this, but one conclusion was that the future of Arab science journalism is with young women. There was a cohort of young women who were really driven, and they were learning fast, they were motivated. I'm sorry, this is the thing that struck out that I remember, but there are probably other things. This is the aggregated data from Arab and African journalists.
Yes, gentlemen.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to follow up with the earlier comment made by Bernard Appia. I'm Bobby from CNS. So Bernard made a comment that a researcher in Ghana told him that how did he get his number. So I have similar experiences with CDC and other research institutions where it is extremely easy. Of course, there's a protocol, there's a process, but it is easy to have, and quite early we get access to US-based researchers for for when results come out for some important scientific studies. And I'm particularly referring to my experience with the PrEP results and the rectal microbicide study, which was happening in US and Thailand. And it took me about 1.5 months to get the approval to interview the Thai researcher in Bangkok. And I had applied for the permission in November, but I got it towards the end of December, and finally the interview happened in January. So I just wanted to make a comment that perhaps research institutions which work in many countries, they really need to look internally so that it is really easy for journalists, at least in terms of bureaucracy and the process, to get access to US-based journalists as researchers as well as in-country researchers. Thanks.
Okay. We're quickly running out of time, and we probably can accommodate just 2 more comments, questions, if they're quite quick. So one from David there, and okay.
Hi, I'm David Dixon, the former director of SciDevNet. I wanted to pick up 2 points from the interesting analysis that Jean-Marc made about the difference in the types of science journalism, and to amplify a little bit on this factor of that you said about its being political differences as much as cultural differences. 2 things that I certainly noticed working on SciDevNet. One is that there seemed to be a certain correlation between the level of science journalism in a country and the extent to which the political authorities in that country paid attention to science. And to a certain extent, a country in which the political authorities realized the importance of science found that reflected in the views of their newspaper editors, magazine editors, because it was part of the political framework that science was important. And therefore, they were prepared to reflect that importance in the way they spoke about science in their newspapers. So, I mean, there's no easy implication from that, but it seems to mean that the science journalists have a self-interest, in a sense, in promoting a greater interest in science and political circles, because that will in itself generate greater interest in science journalism. And to a certain extent, I think what Jean-Marc is saying is, at different levels of development, you have different types of interest in science. If you're at a very low level of development, you're interested in getting more science. You just want more science in everything you do. If you're a much higher level of development, which maybe many of the developed countries are in, you're interested in analysing the type of science you're getting, what is really going on. You're interested much more in the politics of science. Having said that, I think there is also a politics of science in many developing countries, even at the low level. And this is to do with the politics of authority. And this is one problem I've noticed a lot of developing countries, science journalists have, is challenging the authority of scientists. Scientists like to put themselves on a platform. They like to feel that they should be treated as if they are on a platform and given a certain degree of deference. And that deference to scientists tends to be part of a general deference to authority in society. And it's changing that, which is a really challenging job. But what we try to do more and more is to say, just because somebody's a scientist doesn't mean you can't challenge what they're saying, doesn't mean you can't ask questions about it. It also means that you should actually expect them to return your telephone calls. You shouldn't expect to be kept waiting days before a reply or anything like that. So there's a question of authority tied in there, which I think is part of the politics of science and needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's an interesting tension, of course, in terms of also investment in science. I think of the Ethiopian embassy in London, for instance. They're always engaging us, but the kind of issues around authority and control that you describe, you can see that they're struggling to reconcile that. Okay, one more comment here. Actually, I'll just give you my microphone because that's easier.
Hi, I'm Maggie from ResearchC, Asia Research News. I just want to pick up on 2 comments from journalists here, from one Bobby over here and the journalist up there. 8 years ago, I set up ResearchC because there was a difficulty for Asian research institutions to get the news out to the international media. It's been going 8 years now, and it's going quite well, but we still face difficulties where we do media trainings for researchers, and we have researchers who sign up. It's clearly labeled saying media training for researchers, yet some of them come and they're disappointed that it's not about how to get their paper published. Because the trainers, we get Richard Stone from Science and Ruth Francis from Nature to run it. We see Science and Nature and they think, I need to get my paper published. Then when it's about the media, they lose interest. And one problem we do face, we do try to work with press officers to get them to press release the papers, and there are some really good ones out there, and they're really prepared, ready to respond to journalists. But equally, some press officers get scared when an international journalist gets in touch and they come to us and say, can you help us? Maybe because of past responses, or sometimes there's a language problem. It's still a lot of work to be done, but normally the problem we face is trying to convince them you need to send out press releases.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask if anybody on the panel wants to say anything before we hand over to Tiovo to sum up.
I just want to say that David did a much better presentation than me. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you for everybody, for the panelists, for Nick, for so wonderfully leading this panel discussion. It was a hot debate, of course, partly due to the Finnish exceptional weather. I think that I was going to make a summarize a little bit, but I don't want to use too much time. That's why we also gave audience the possibility to so many questions. But I think that in this discussion we came to the very basics, the fundamental things of science, journalism, and even journalism in general. I think the word cultural was quite the main important word in this topic, and I think we got very concrete examples how really it can be. If you look at African and Arab countries, as Jean-Marc said, so seemingly there are more important to get things done and even the society to be changed. So that's in a way the same kind of conflict or different points of one universe of science itself, practical science versus the very basic science. And it seems to me that perhaps in some countries it is more needed to emphasize on the practical science even in science journalism. Of course, it also is one of the basic questions of journalism itself. Should it reflect the facts, and how much you should really try to make educational journalism, which comes very much closer than to the area which in most Western countries has been divided in a way. In my lifetime work, I was working for the alcohol treatment systems, and I had all the time the very same question: should I be the one who is bringing forward the results of the alcohol researchers and science, or should I take more care of how make quickest possible benefit of that to the treatment staff and patients? And also, I think that it came one point, which is the infrastructure. We should remember, of course, that in many parts of the world, people are not even able to read and write. So even the new channels and methods of science journalism with internet and all the electronics is not perhaps always so much useful, but we have to be more trusting on the old methods. But they are, of course, coming. And finally, I think that this discussion showed how many-folded really the whole issue is, as it often happens, that what seems to be quite simple in the beginning is not at all of that when we are finishing. But one word, however, which I would like to finish my little interpretation of this discussion is that training, however, is perhaps the main thing that is needed. Training journalists is not easy. I know it by my own experience after training 25 years Finnish journalism in a very specific part of science journalism, which is addictions. But I think that we were able to develop a good relation and get journalists to come to the training session. It was not easy, it was quite not even cheap, but I think that we were able just to make a little bit closer to the prejudices which are normally there between journalists, scientists, and in my case also the treatment staff. It is possible to overcome these prejudices, but it takes time and it takes efforts, but probably it will benefit. So thank you very much for everyone. Any other announcements of organizers? No? Sun is still shining?